All right, welcome back, everybody, to the third in our series of Fair Dialogues for this season. It's a surprise how quickly the season has gone by. We're already on our third dialogue. If you haven't caught the previous two before this, please do go and check them out. We had a wonderful conversation with Susan Ferguson, who's the UN Women's representative here in India. We spoke about not just about gender, but we spoke about the role of intergovernmental organizations across the world and how they function and so on and so forth. Made for a wonderful conversation. We moved on to our second dialogue with Akhila Sivadas, who is the founder of the Center of Advocacy and Research. And I think there were, again, a lot of conversations about how to actually get things done on the ground and what it takes to make a difference in the lives of communities that one intervenes in, right? And today, too, as you can see on your screen, we've got a wonderful guest with us, Professor Richard Black, who is the Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Head of the College of Social Sciences at the University of Birmingham. Just in terms of his areas that he's been covering over these years, and there's too many to recount right now, but he has researched extensively on the relationship that exists between migration and mobility, poverty, climate change, and of course the interplay between all of those various things. And I'm sure that at some point in time in this conversation, we'll talk to him about that as well. But Richard, thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with us. I know this is your second year with us. Last year, you were a mentor to one of our change makers, and this year you've agreed very graciously to speak with all of them on this conversation right now. So thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure, Ramit.
Perfect. So let us get straight into it. And as I was telling you before we went live, that I'm a curious cat right now with respect to a lot of things that you've been up to. But as is probably customary, at least in this season, I want to begin by asking you your motivations as to why you chose the stream of work that you've chosen, right? Because at the end of the day, I think over the years, there are numerous young minds that you have helped develop, helped frame, helped give them the tools to do things that they've been doing after they've had the opportunity to interact with you. And this whole ecosystem you've created for yourself as well of dealing and handling and working with young adults, I think is absolutely wonderful. But what made you actually start doing this, of wanting to become a professor and work with young adults in the first place?
So that's a great question, and I like you describing yourself as a curious cat, because I think of myself a little bit as such a person as well. In my job, I do three things. One is I do research, and that much of my career has been devoted to research, as you say, on migration, refugees, poverty, development, climate change. Second thing I do is education. At the moment, I run quite a large college here at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Students across the social sciences. I think we have about 12,000 of them, undergraduates, postgraduates, people well into their later stages of their life, studying a whole variety of social science subjects. And of course, I've been an educator myself. And then the third thing I do is the management and administration that goes with it. I mean, the reason that I've got into those things is slightly different, although they go together in UK academia. So the teaching side, I am in no doubt whatsoever that the fact that I was able to go to university as an 18-year-old and have a university education, a good university education, has helped set me up for my life and enabled me to do things that I hope have helped others. So I'm very passionate about education and the opportunity for people to go to university and to benefit from a university education. The research side, it goes to what you say about curiosity. I've always been curious about how people live their lives, but more importantly, I've had probably a sense of fairness all of my life, and so I felt disturbed about the fact that some people are more able to live their lives in a good and productive and enjoyable way than others, and I wanted to understand what are the constraints to more people being able to live a good life, and that's how I essentially got interested in migration. And then the administration and management side of it, well, I'm quite a strong believer that universities should be independent of government and big business and other interests. And if we're going to be that, then academics need to step forward and take leadership roles when they're asked or when it's possible for them to do so. So I have done that. I never set out to be a university leader, but somewhere along the line, somebody asked me if I would do a leadership position, and I said yes, because I thought it was important that I responded positively. And then one thing leads to another, and a lot of life is happen chance.
No, and I'm sure that a lot of people are glad that you actually ended up saying yes to that, Richard, because again, the independence of our institutions is so crucial in our world today, to make sure that we get the right sort of education out there and the right kind of research going, and the independence of an institution is core to that. But you really set us up for this conversation by breaking your life down in those three categories of education, research, and administration, right? So let's perhaps tackle them one by one, and starting with education. Starting with the kind of individuals that come in and study, and you've been doing this for decades now, right? So what I want to try and understand from you is what you really see as the difference in the mindset of students as they come into university over the period that you've actually been doing this, right? Are you seeing that the motivations that one had for university change over the years? Or do you believe that the motivations are usually, and there are always all types of motivations, whichever decade or whichever year you may actually be getting students in to university in?
Well, the big thing that's changed over my lifetime, certainly in the UK, is the proportion of people who go to university. When I went to university as an 18-year-old, I was one of just 12% of my cohort who went on to university. That's actually a tiny proportion. And if I were going to university today as an 18-year-old, I'd be one of over 50% going to university. So that's, of course, a big difference, and influences the kind of motivations that students have. Having said that, for 18-year-olds going to university, I think there has always been a mix of motivations. Some people who went on to university because they really couldn't think of anything else to do, or because their parents expected them to do it. Right through to other people who've got a very clear idea that they want to be a doctor or a lawyer or or work in business, and that a university education is the way to do that, and then all elements in between. I mean, one thing that has changed over the last 30 or more years that I've been in academia is the diversity of our student population. So more and more, I found myself teaching mid-career professionals, people who are going back to university because they see the value of engaging with other work that we do in university, the value of that for the role that they're carrying out in their professional lives. And we do that, of course, now through a wide variety of mechanisms. So classically in Britain, we've had 1-year master's courses, but increasingly we now have online master's programs that typically last a longer period of time. You do them bit by bit as you work. We've blended learning programs, of course, as well. We have continuing professional development is an area that we do now. And from my point of view, as somebody who's always been engaged in research as an academic as well, those students who come back mid-career are particularly interesting because they are helping me to understand the world that I'm trying to study, as well as giving me an opportunity to have a more direct impact from education into the world of work. So to me, that's the big change, the number of people coming to university, which is great, and the extent of engagement between university and all different parts of life, which isn't to say that everything in education is fantastic, but those are some really positive changes.
No, good. I completely agree with you with respect to the diversity increasing. I think even here in India and South Asia, we're seeing it not being as much of a stigma to start your education in later years than it used to be, because in large parts of South Asia, we've got ages for everything, right? And if you miss the bus, invariably you'll end up not getting an education. Whereas I think that the number of times that I'm seeing students taking gap years now, gap years was never a thing in South Asia, but that's increasing now. people are starting work and then going to university after they've worked for a few years, and that's happening more and more now. But with that, perhaps also comes a challenge, Richard. And I think at the FAIR project, at our online experiential program that we run, we also work with young adults from the age groups of 18 to 27. Right, so there's it's not a massive gap, but there is still that 9-year gap between the youngest and the eldest person in our group. And we also find it a bit of a challenge, and they all find it a bit of a challenge. They're listening in right now to actually relate to each other. And it takes them time to actually be able to mingle, because they've got different lives, they're in different parts of their journey, and so on and so forth. And it happens, but it does take time. And sometimes perhaps it may also be, there may be a risk of that compromising on the kind of education they receive, because of the environment that they're in is not of I don't want to say peers, but I believe everyone's peers, but people who are of the same age or of the same demographic, and so on and so forth, right? So is that something that you think holds any weight, or do you believe that rather than that being a risk, it's actually an opportunity? And clearly you treat it like an opportunity, but do you also see that bit of discomfort that students perhaps get into because of this diversity that's increased?
So it's an interesting observation, but I would counter with two things. So the first is, it is never too late to learn. One of the joys of my job is that I get to interact with quite a lot of our alumni, and I remember vividly visiting an alum in New York a few years ago, who had been very kind to the university, a great friend, and he was in his 90s. In fact, a very distinguished scholar in his own right. And I spotted on his desk a primer in Spanish. And I asked him about it, and he said, yeah, I'm trying to learn Spanish. This is a man who already spoke, I think, about 15 languages. But he said, I'm trying to learn Spanish because I want to be able to speak to my cleaner at home in her own language. And in any case, if you stop learning, you die. And I thought that was such a great thing for somebody at such a great age to say. So going back to your particular point, no, I think that there's a huge opportunity for us of having people of different ages in the classroom, and a huge opportunity for the people in the classroom as well. So I always used to revel in having groups in my master's programs that ranged from students who studied with us and who were going straight onto a master's program because they felt, they needed a bit more preparation before going into the job market, or they wanted to specialize perhaps for an academic career. And then other people who were, perhaps in their 30s or even 40s, who had quite a bit of professional experience that they were bringing to the class as well. And I always used to say in the first class that, you have a unique resource here in each other. So I'm doing some of the teaching, but you have so much to teach each other. The people who've recently finished their undergraduate degree, you understand how a university works. So you can teach all of these older people, where things are in the library, and, what the ritual of university life is, because that's often quite strange for people coming into it who haven't been there for a long time. And then, of course, the people who've been in professional life, you can help the younger people on the course understand what the challenges are that you've faced in professional life, and how all of the theories that we talk about in class actually work out in practice in the workplace. So I think that diversity in the classroom is actually a real educational opportunity, and it's one of the things that really stimulates me. And that's not to say that you can't have very good educational experiences with a class full of 18-year-olds who've come straight from school, and we're coming up to that in a few months again, the rhythm of new students coming in for the first time, having finished their school careers and moving on to university. That's an exciting time too. But there are all kinds of different opportunities. And I would say to the change makers, think about the opportunities that confront you in the here and now. Don't wish that you were in a different place or with a different set of people and then you could make a difference. You can make a difference with the people who are in the room with you now. So try to understand who they are and what that difference would look like.
No, absolutely. And inevitably, and I'm sure that you've seen this in your classrooms as well, that everyone has something to provide, of course, and that's something that you've been saying as well. And there are also different times in which they provide that, right? So I think it's also important for everyone to recognize that it wouldn't be on day one that you'll actually realize the value of everyone that you're around and the entire class that you have. It may take time, right? And there'll be certain individuals who like to just sit back and listen and not engage too much initially, and only when they get comfortable will they start talking. That's their way, that's their style. It's absolutely perhaps okay. There'll be those who will be extremely eager to have conversations, but for a limited period of time, and would not have the time to actually see through a particular conversation. There will be those who will keep talking, and you'll have to really tell them, okay, fine, just pause now. We've heard a lot from you. And all of those experiences, and all of those are different things that everyone brings onto the table, which is just wonderful to experience, really. But so we're moving on. I think what I want to, and what I was getting a hint of when you were talking, Richard, and especially when you spoke of how you get those younger students to mix with those who are elder by showing them what is it that both of them provide to each other. It seems that you clearly have other techniques in with which you make learning more accessible and more available, fun, perhaps, to your students. So are there any other things that you actually end up using to make sure that they get the most of being in your classroom?
Well, lots of things, and probably too many to go through now. When I was a little bit earlier in my career, I used to have a book that I went through every year. It was called 50 Things to Do in a Seminar. And I think I got through most of the 50 different things. And one of the things that I tried to do was to use a different technique each year, or different set of techniques, because that that variation, I think, helped to keep me lively as a teacher, so that I'm not just teaching the same thing that I've taught before in the same way that I've taught before. But it also helps you to understand how configuring the classroom in a slightly different way might lead to a different outcome, and so it makes the education process also a learning process for everybody that's involved. So I mean, I don't know that I hesitate to say, oh, this is a good way to promote learning in the classroom, because actually all different forms of pedagogy can promote learning in the classroom. And occasionally I do chalk and talk as well, because that's effective. If it wasn't effective, teachers wouldn't have been using it for hundreds of years. But there are other things that can be effective, and we also know that this is a point that goes beyond education. I think people's attention spans vary. But an hour is quite a long time, and this interview is an hour, so apologies. But typically at university, a lecture is an hour. That's a long time for somebody to concentrate. So I'm a very strong believer in breaking that up into smaller chunks, having different things that come up, so that you can renew the interest of people whose attention is perhaps flagging, and make sure that different ideas in the classroom also get an opportunity to be shared.
Right. Now, again, while you were talking, and I'm loving this conversation, because everything that you're saying is making me go in different directions already. But you spoke about all of these different ideas that you deploy in your seminars, right? And then you said that what really caught my attention was, but then you come back to chalk and talk as well when the need arises, right? But that's the traditional way of imparting education, right? And sometimes you need to go back to that, of course, right? What I've noticed really a lot these days is one of the mantras that we keep talking to our young adults and our students about is thinking out of the box. And this whole idea of thinking out of the box has become really, really popular. And I love it. Don't get me wrong, right? But at times, I also do believe that what ends up happening is that we end up neglecting some of the age-old efficacious, efficient manners and ways which work, which have been proven to work, and then we ignore them for wanting to think out of the box, right? And that becomes something
you have to remember what's in the box as well.
Exactly, right. And I think that's just something that I always want. And and you've hit the nail on the head, right? Like, how do you think out of the box to the time you don't know what's in the box in the first place, right? And doesn't that lead to a situation where a lot of students these days, while of course it's great to challenge and great to question and all of that, right? But they move away from the box itself, right? And how do we find, have you found a way in which you can make sure that they first recognize everything that's in the box before they move out of the box? Or is that something that happens in parallel? Or how do we really create that balance between what is understood to be effective and what, of course, we want them to think and innovate and do all the wonderful things that one does at university?
So, I mean, the first thing I would say is that in all university courses, certainly in the UK, we have a set of learning outcomes that we expect a student to have achieved, and there's a curriculum that goes with that, and indeed there are a load of assessments, potentially exams, that go with that as well. So if you're an engineer and you don't learn how to be an engineer, then you're not going to get accredited as an engineer. So there's something inbuilt in our system that ensures that is the case, certainly at undergraduate level. I mean, I think if I could use a slightly different example, throughout my career, I've been interested in interdisciplinarity as a concept. So bringing to bear the insights of different disciplines on the same problem in a connected way. So different to multidisciplinary, where you have different disciplines working independently on a topic. So getting people to work together on the same topic and share ideas. So a lot of my work has been in that interdisciplinary space. And indeed, when I left university after doing my geography degree, I was of the view that disciplines didn't really matter and that I didn't really want to be a geographer. I wanted to be an interdisciplinary scholar. And I have modified my view a little bit over the years, because I have realized that when I enter those interdisciplinary spaces and talk with people from other disciplines, they are all nonetheless bringing skills and discipline knowledge that if they weren't bringing that, I probably wouldn't benefit so much from the conversations. And so that has made me think very hard about what my own disciplinary knowledge is, what's the core of what I know that other people maybe don't know so much because they haven't had that training. So that's led me both to engage much more with my own discipline later on in my career, but also to be mindful of what I'm bringing to the conversation. So, that to me very much is the inside the box, in the box paradox. If we all stay inside our disciplinary boxes, we're not going to be at the forefront of knowledge. We're not going to be dealing with the most interesting things in the most interesting way. But on the other hand, if we're all trying, if I go into interdisciplinary conversation and try and pretend that I know as much about economics as somebody who's done a master's or PhD in economics, still less if I try and pretend that I know anything at all about engineering or medicine, then I'm not going to get very far, because the truth is I don't know very much about engineering or medicine, and my knowledge of economics is rudimentary. So we have our specialisms, we train for those in universities, and then that's the base on which those really interesting conversations can happen. And certainly as an academic, but I think this actually applies more broadly in public life, in business. You need to know what you're bringing to the conversation, but you also need to be open to a conversation with people who are bringing something very different to the conversation. And that's where you get outside the box and challenge yourself in really interesting ways.
No, absolutely, and I think that's the real blend that one needs to see, that it's not if this or that, right? There really isn't a choice. It really has to be both, and you need to find a way to make sure that both exist in a manner which is synchronized, really, in some way, shape, or form. Now, let's just move on to. before I move on to research, and then I do want to talk to you quite a bit about that also. But what about those students who may not necessarily be as motivated as the others, right? I'm sure that in every classroom we do end up seeing that and noticing that not everyone has the kind of passion that you've got, Richard, right? You've got that passion for learning, curious cat as both of us are, and so on and so forth. It's just inherent in the way that we are, right? But inevitably, you'll find a lot of individuals who may not necessarily have that. And I'm not saying there's just one way to be. Of course, that may be absolutely fine as well. But sometimes you do believe that curiosity is actually locked in, because they don't. Sometimes they don't recognize that they actually are curious, because I personally believe all human beings are curious in some way, shape, or form, right? But in many, it's subdued, right? So do you have any thoughts on that, as to how all of us, like right now, we at the FAIR project as well, we're trying to get all of them to expand their minds, to try and think beyond what they've been thinking about, speaking with individuals like yourself, so that their brain starts working and they start thinking in different directions. But sometimes it becomes a bit difficult also with those who don't necessarily have that sort of zeal and passion to actually participate in the way that they can actually benefit the most from university. Do you have any ways or thoughts in which the university or you can actually make them also benefit as much as the others who are actually passionate and zealous?
So I would hazard a guess that most people are passionate about something. And so if they're not passionate about what I'm talking about in the classroom, the question is, what are they passionate about? And is there a way of making a connection between what I find exciting and what they would find exciting? I accept that probably doesn't work in every circumstance. And certainly that insight would lead me to wanting to have a dialogue, wanting to have a discussion about what might be interesting. But I recognize that in some cases that might not necessarily lead down a path that I can action. There are also, of course, many other pressures on young people's lives. I assume it is not too dissimilar in India to the UK and parts of Europe. We have what is approaching a youth mental health crisis in the UK at the moment, and part of that is to do, I think, with the pressure that young people feel that they are under to be certain kinds of people, whether that's pressure from their parents or pressure from social media or pressure from other young people, from their peers. And this is a very real thing. Mental health issues are a major issue for our universities. Actually, they're a major issue for young people well beyond our universities. So simply talking about having a passion for something isn't necessarily going to counter these kinds of larger trends, which I would take as larger trends in society. But at the very least, stopping and thinking, well, I am not engaging with the student, or the student is not engaging with me. Why? And is there a conversation that can be had? I think that's a really important thing to do. And again, I would say that extends beyond the field of education. Somebody not displaying a shared passion with you about something may, of course, just mean that they disagree with you. And if they disagree with you, at the very least, that is an opportunity to sharpen your argument. And it might be an opportunity to persuade, to realize change, or indeed to change yourself. If the argument that somebody else is making punctures your own passion, then we should probably let that happen and think about what is it about the way that we were thinking about something, however enthusiastic we might have been about it, that was perhaps wrong or could be adjusted in some way, that we could have a clearer and better understanding of whatever it is, the subject that we're talking about. So yeah, I mean, if I be honest with you, I don't see that students today are any more or less motivated than they've been at any point during my career and throughout my career. And one of the reasons I love working in a university is because young people often are very motivated, passionate, and articulate about things, but they don't always see eye to eye, and that's glorious, actually, that people don't see eye to eye. And universities should be places in which we can not see eye to eye and work that out in in a measured, sensible, tolerant, engaged kind of a way, because sometimes outside in wider society that is more difficult. So if universities can't do that, where can we do that? I don't know if I feel I might have wandered a bit from your question.
No, not at all, Richard. I think that was absolutely wonderful, because again, I think you've hit the nail right on the head, in my opinion, and it's really taking me to a different question. And I wanted to go to research, but I have to bring administration in right now, but that's another role that you fulfill. And aren't there times when there's a bit of a conflict between the administrator Richard Black and the educator Richard Black, in terms of objectives to be met, and so on and so forth, right? Because the same way, and I don't want to generalize at all, right? But I think at least in Indian universities, we see this quite a bit, and I've heard a bit about the Western universities as well, is where the educator will continue to ask students to question. And as you said, it's wonderful that they disagree, and it's wonderful that they get you to sharpen your arguments, and so on and so forth, as an educator. But as an administrator, you need everyone to follow the rules. You need people to agree with the kind of format or the structure that you've created for your program to be operated with, right? Now, again, I'm fairly certain, as you as an individual, I can see where you create that balance, and I can probably assume that already. But isn't there some sort of a conflict between these two roles? And have you ever experienced that for yourself, just in your head, saying that, okay, now which one am I? Am I the administrator right now, or am I the educator right now?
Well, the biggest challenge I have as an administrator is that there's never really enough resource or money to do all of the things that we would like to do. Right. And our educators find that frustrating, because we're often asking our educators to work longer hours, to do more things, to achieve more, sometimes than they can reasonably be expected to do. And another complication is, we ask our educators to do a lot, but then they are often, well, in fact, they're almost always extremely motivated people who want to do a lot themselves. And so you have this challenge between what we are asking faculty colleagues and indeed other people in administration, what we're asking them to do, and then the things that they want to do themselves that we're not asking them to do, but that they believe are really important. And so workload issues are a very big issue in UK universities at the moment. There's been a recent spate of industrial action around that, involving some universities, not at the moment in my own, and there are real issues here. So resource is a big thing. I mean, in relation to the clash between following the rules on the one hand and innovating and being brilliant on the other. That's what I took to be the gist of your question. For me, it's about working out which are the things that are most important in any particular circumstance. So sometimes, I probably shouldn't say this as a university leader, but sometimes my colleagues break the rules, and I think, well, actually, that was a sensible thing for you to do, because there was another primary purpose here that motivated you doing that, and universities would be much the poorer if we didn't occasionally have people breaking rules and indeed helping us to institute new rules. On the other hand, if everybody broke rules all the time, then the whole institution would collapse. And again, that's something that I don't think is particular to universities. You need this balance between working within the framework for the bulk of what you do, so that things just tick over and that you can function, and that you're not in a state of constant flux and argument. But on the other hand, being prepared to think outside the box, as we were talking about earlier, including in relation to our own practices, and seeking to nudge, or even in some cases force, change in the way that we operate if that is not working. I mean, the biggest kinds of difficulties of that kind come where the way that one subject needs to organize something, for example, comes up against another subject that needs to organize in a different way. And you have an administrative system, often these days a computer or IT system, that needs to work in one way and cannot be configured so that there is endless variation at local level. So I do often have to persuade my colleagues that yes, it would be better in some respects if every subject were allowed to do things in the way that they wanted to. But that would mean that our administrative systems would not work at all, and everybody would be much the poorer for it. So we have to find some kind of accommodation. I mean, it's also true, incidentally, if you have any students who are studying across discipline, if those two disciplines then operate in completely different ways, that can make that crossover incompatible. And back to my earlier point, it might be the boundary between those two disciplines that is the really interesting place to be. And it would be terrible if we let a bureaucratic or administrative reason get in the way of being able to to cross-fertilize across two disciplines.
And I think the reason why you speak with such clarity about it, I'm saying clarity, even though, again, there were multiple conversations you had right now, is because you're both an educator and an administrator, and you're not just an administrator, right? Which allows you to then see things as clearly as you do. Because while you did speak about sometimes giving them the leeway and sometimes not, and which is a subjective call at the end of the day, I actually find that to be extremely objective, because that's what at the FAIR project we keep talking about this all the time, that there is no one right answer, right?
Yeah.
You have to look at every situation for what it is, and then be honest to yourself, be fair, run the research, advocate for alternate viewpoints, introspect, and then finally reach the conclusion that you need to reach, right?
I had years ago an academic colleague who was a genuine administrator's nightmare. He didn't produce reading lists. He was totally disorganized. He didn't do any of the things that administrators asked us to do. And at the end of the year, when he taught his students, he always got a kind of a bifurcated set of student evaluations. So there were some students who thought he was absolutely awful, the worst teacher they had ever had, because he didn't do all of these things that he was supposed to do. But he always had another group of students who thought he was the best teacher they had ever met, the most fantastic guy. Now, I would say every university should have one or two people like that. And from time to time, every student should probably be exposed to somebody like that, because they really, he really stretched the students, and he did it in the most unorthodox ways. But on the other hand, if everybody in the department, never mind the university, was like this guy, we would not function. And if you're a young person, you're thinking, I want to be that person, my other comment would be, you have to have such a strength of character and direction to pull that off. I mean, he was brilliant, disorganized, but brilliant. So, I think we all need a humility check. Are we really brilliant enough to behave in that way? And I have quite a few other colleagues, or have had quite a few other colleagues, and I don't think I have them at Birmingham, who think that they're that brilliant and try and behave in that way, but actually they don't instill that sense of awe in a group of students that this is the most exciting thing that they've ever seen. So that's much less acceptable behavior.
No, understood. Absolutely right. I'm just thinking in my head all the teachers that I've had, and I can clearly place them in the buckets that you mentioned. So, but no, one thing that you mentioned, and I do want to pick up on this as well, also because it's something that's worried me for a very very long time. And we've touched upon it briefly, the independence of our educational institutions, right? And where you also again just spoke about the lack of resources being one of the biggest challenges that an administrator faces, right? um, Now my question is really in two parts. So one is, uh, if there was an ideal situation of how we can ensure that our universities stay independent and have the resources to do all that they need to do, uh, what would that ideal situation actually be, right? Where does this funding come from, and or how do we actually function in a manner which can allow for an institution to remain independent as well as be as innovative as they want because the resources are available. And second, one that was ideal part, and the second is the practical part. That in today's scenarios, which we see that one of the key ways for an institution to have the resources is either be influenced by the government or be influenced by corporates, because that's where the fundraising actually ends up happening from, right? So in that scenario, practically, what's the way in which one can actually try and seek to find more resources for our universities in the kind of scenario that we're in. So I'm happy. I'd love to hear both your ideal situation as well as practically what you're probably facing on a day-to-day basis.
So, I mean, university funding in India and the UK is very different. As I understand it, university funding in India, at least for the state sector, is state funded. That has some considerable advantages. I benefited myself from going through a state funded system in which I did not have to pay for my degree, and I didn't come out with significant debts. And I feel very badly that subsequent generations have had to experience that. I think the problem we have with the system in Britain at the moment is that the education is almost 100% funded by the students, so that's not very good either. And although we have some scholarships in place from a variety of sources, including for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to get to university, that doesn't feel right. I mean, my ideal situation would be one in which universities are, and each university is funded from a variety of sources. And in that way, the cost of university education is shared amongst the different beneficiaries. There's no question that an individual does benefit from a university education in most cases. And so asking the individual to repay some of that benefit is not unreasonable. But society also benefits from there being a cohort of people educated to university level. So I think it is not unreasonable for the state to share some of that as well. And for that matter, of course, businesses also benefit from having educated people. And whilst they pay those people when they employ them, I think it is entirely reasonable that businesses also put back something into the education system more broadly. So what we try and do at Birmingham, my university in the UK, is we try to make sure that we are pursuing lots of different avenues for funding. As I mentioned before, we have regular conversations with alumni. We also have conversations with businesses, with philanthropic organizations of different kinds, trying to put forward a proposition that the funding that they might put into the university would reflect some benefit to themselves, whilst not undermining the university's autonomy, and recognizing our shared interest in a positive learning environment and a productive research environment as well. And we do have quite a number of business and philanthropic sponsors, as well as government money through research councils and student fee income. So there's quite a diversity of money that comes into UK universities, including my own. Although I don't think that the balance at the moment is entirely right. I would say that we are probably asking a little bit too much of our students in terms of repayment. And there could probably be a bit more funding, both from government and from business. Businesses are, obviously often quite hard-nosed and want to realize more immediate benefits in many cases from investments that they make in universities. And it's partly my job as a senior university leader to persuade businesses of the longer term benefits of a more kind of structured and strategic engagement with a university like ours, which I think do build from working together over time in a more kind of open way.
Yeah, and I completely understand that. One of the things, and I just want to put that out there before we start speaking a bit about research itself right now, because I do want to get that in before our hour is up. But one of the things that I've been contemplating for a while now is to have a way of creating a central university fund where there are multiple universities that come together and participate in that fund, and where universities are not just raising monies for themselves and resources for themselves, but for a group of universities. So the advantage of that, at least in my opinion, is that while the corporate or the government ends up funding that fund, which university actually receives those funds is anonymous, right? Is something that the corporate does not know, and hence the overall influence that they can perhaps have on the research at that particular university reduces. Now, of course, the biggest problem with what I'm stating here is that the corporate also likes to be able to, if not say influence, not all of them influence it, but then always would like to direct the kind of research that ends up happening because of the money that they're sending in, right? Which may reduce the overall size of the corpus. But if you can find a way for that not to happen, but still have money coming into that corpus and then being spread across universities rather than only a single university, then overall, maybe collectively, the education system in countries, and not just the UK, but in a lot of other countries, would end up benefiting quite a bit without the loss of independence that usually comes with funding. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, and then we can move on to research.
So we do that around particular areas or challenges. In my own research for about a decade, I ran a research center on migration and poverty that was spread across, I think at its largest extent, it was about 7 universities worldwide, including in South Asia and in Africa, as well as in Europe. And we fundraised collectively amongst those universities for research on migration. And actually, only today, I was at a meeting of our university's council earlier today, and we've approved an investment fund where we are working together with other universities in the West Midlands region, because Birmingham is not the only excellent university in the West Midlands, and we want to work collaboratively with other universities that are close to us. And that's about developing private investment to invest in essentially in commercialization of our collective university research. So we do work with other universities, both our regional neighbours, some other universities nationally and then internationally, but it tends to be around specific objectives or challenges, and it would probably be quite hard to do it in any other way, although I'd be interested to hear more if you think that there is another way that we could do it, because in my view, collaboration is the route to solving many of the world's problems, and we in the university environment, we far too easily fall into competition instead, and I don't believe that universities fundamentally are or should be competing with each other. We all have broadly the same mission, which is to educate and to understand.
Exactly. Absolutely. Lots more conversations we can have around that, but I am mindful of time. So we've got a question also from one of our change makers, and a lot of this has been me paraphrasing questions that I've been receiving on the side from them as well, but just primarily asking, and I'm probably stating their own reality as well, and then being very honest about it, that when it comes down to research and when it comes down to solving a problem or having a discussion, it's really fun till you understand what you're talking about. But the moment it becomes difficult, and when you start hitting a roadblock, it either becomes boring or it becomes something that you believe that you really can't take forward anymore, right? Now, in such situations, how do individuals keep at it and not end up giving up right? And especially because they also get burdened by the fact that they were having so much fun till the time they were understanding what they were doing, or when they had the kind of research that was coming their way. But the moment it becomes difficult is really when a lot of people end up giving up. So if you've got any thoughts to help with that, that would be very useful.
So I don't know that I've ever experienced that myself. One of my former colleagues told me, and I've always remembered this, you should keep doing something as long as you're learning and enjoying it. If you're only doing one of those, that's okay, but you might think about doing something else. And if you're doing neither of those things, you should stop doing what you're doing and do something else now. Because if you're not learning and you're not enjoying it, why are you doing it? So I see that you could hit a problem and you could feel that that problem was insuperable, and that could lead you to lose heart or indeed get bored. I mean, I think it's more likely to be that you lose confidence that you can actually solve the problem rather than you get bored with the problem per se. The question I would then ask is the problem worth solving? If the problem's still worth solving, then the obvious question is if you are done with it, who else could take it on? Because we don't all have the same skill set, and it might be that you've done your bit and somebody else needs to take it over. I mean, I'm a passionate believer in academics being involved with public policy and engaging with public policy organizations, and I've done that for much of my academic career. But I'm not a public policy maker, and I don't work in Parliament or in an international organization. I did have a brief dalliance with both of those, but anyway, that's not where I work. And so it might be that if it comes to the point where organizational change or legislation is what is needed to shift the dial on the thing that I've been working on, that it's not my role to achieve that, and I need to pass it on to somebody else. Of course, what I don't think is that I should simply say, well, that's not my problem, so I'm going to let somebody else sort that out. If I want to be part of the change, if I want to solve a problem, then it is my problem. But the extent of my role in solving that problem is to find the people and engage with the people who will take it over the line. So we should all be mindful of what the limits are to what we can achieve, and work within those limits, and not pretend that we are able to do things that we can't, or indeed that we are interested in things that we're not interested in. If you're not interested in, if you're bored with something, it's probably a good time to move on to something else and make sure that thing that you were interested in has also moved on to somebody else.
I think that's been the theme of a large part of our conversation, Richard, is the whole idea of collaboration, right? And recognizing that you're not in it alone. So whether you're in the classroom with a diverse set of individuals, you learn from them, you learn from the experiences, or as you said right now, if you're hitting a stumbling block, if you think that you're reaching a dead end with respect to what you can do, doesn't mean that someone else can't go beyond. And then that's what you can actually do before you move on to something else that you want to do. And I think just that theme of collaboration is popping out in all sorts of ways during this conversation, which is brilliant. Now, I just have one more question for you before we move on to our final question. And which is actually what you led with when you spoke about fairness being one of the things that you always strive for, right? And I'm going to probably merge both these questions. In all the work that you've done around migration and the work, and there's a lot of body of work that you've done. I've looked at a bit of it. Of course, I haven't had the chance to look at everything, but what really do you believe is the role of research in solving for these problems that you're looking at, and this interplay of problems that you're looking at? Because sometimes what ends up happening is that people end up complaining that if we keep researching about this, when will we actually take action? And then when we take action, it's not backed by research, and that causes its own set of problems at the end of the day, right? And these problems are long-standing problems. These are not problems that get solved in a day, or there's no silver bullet for any of them, right? So in your opinion, what is the real value of the work that you're doing in these very, very serious areas that you're working on?
So I feel very strongly that research and action need to go hand in hand. if you feel passionately about something and you have an argument, you should not wait for research to make that argument, because the simple fact of making the argument opens that up to scrutiny and enables us to understand whether that is a thing that really needs to be done anyway. So nobody needs to wait for research. But on the other hand, lots of the arguments that we have about public policy, which is my field, tend to be based on caricatures or even stereotypes of the actors that we're trying to influence. I mean, just to give an example, not from my own work, but in relation to the recent COVID-19 crisis, one of the things that stopped our government from implementing measures to stop the spread of COVID earlier was a belief that people would not respect those measures, that people would not do it. Now, you couldn't have implemented research in the timeframes that we were talking about, but actually, in part, that reflected a real lack of funding for research in public health, and therefore a real lack of understanding about how people do interact with public health measures. And what we found very quickly in the pandemic, in the UK at least, was that people did actually respect sensible measures that were brought in pretty quickly and for quite some time. So if we had had a better research base on public health, we would have been in a much better place to implement measures that would have stopped the hundreds of thousands of people dying that actually died in the pandemic here. So that's an example not from my area. I mean, if I go to my area, people have all kinds of preconceptions and stereotypes of migrants and refugees, and it's always been my starting premise, largely because many of the migrants and refugees that I've met during the course of 30 years researching this as a topic, my starting premise is that migrants and refugees are like everybody else. I could tomorrow become a refugee or a migrant. And so, there is no stereotype that adequately frames who migrants and refugees are in some kind of essential sense. But there are a lot of experiences that people who become migrants and refugees experience that I do not experience, and that most people do not experience. And so that's a matter for research. That's a matter for understanding what the world looks like for somebody who is in a very different position to that of members of the elite in the global north who are making policy that affects people far away. So that's why I'm interested in research on this topic, because I think there is something concrete to learn about how people live their lives in different circumstances that could be really valuable in informing a better public policy. But I also happen to think alongside that we should be much more welcoming of migrants and refugees and diversity in general. But that's a political position, just to be clear. That's it's not directly related to my research. But actually my research reinforces the notion that if you did treat people in a more open and fair way, that would not be a big economic, social, or indeed environmental problem. It would throw up some challenges, because all kinds of changes throw up challenges, but they are challenges that are eminently capable of being resolved.
Absolutely, and I personally always believed that a lot of the discrimination that happens in our world is because of the identities that we place on people rather than their own actual identities, right? Because they're actually, like, your actual identity, Richard, is not the fact that you live in London or the fact that you're British or that you're a professor, but your actual identity are the thoughts that you've got, right? And that's what I've always believed in. And unfortunately, because we provide these identities to individuals, we become less welcoming of them. We start seeing them as different to us, and that invariably leads to a situation that we're not really legislating or making policies for human beings, but we're really legislating and making policies for these identities, which can't even be personified, really, in my opinion, because every individual is their own individual, not that identity. Yet, what we're really making policies for are those identities, which which again, I just found it very difficult to grasp. But we're on the hour mark. We can't let you leave before asking us our customary question that we ask everybody who comes on the FAIR dialogue. And a word that you've mentioned on multiple occasions, right at the beginning and in the back end here as well, fairness. And what does that really mean to you? And what do you think being fair really is all about?
So the big thing that has motivated my career that relates to fairness is the fact that as a student, I got the chance to travel to Africa on 2 occasions to visit refugee camps to understand more about the situation of refugees. And those refugees could not travel to where I live, and indeed the communities hosting those refugees could not travel to where I live. And I regarded that as fundamentally unfair. And although there may be practical obstacles to allowing everybody to move wherever they like, I recognize that. I don't think I'm an advocate for open borders, but I do think that we need to have a more fair engagement with the situation that people are in. And so then that translates into a whole load of other things. Very soon after that, I started working with academics in Africa. And I discovered that they couldn't read the things that I read because their libraries didn't have access to them. And it's made me a lifelong advocate of open access publishing, because it's fundamentally unfair that I'm in a rich institution, and to be an academic in a rich institution means you can read whatever you like, and to be an academic in a poor institution in the global south means you can not read very much, and most of it is hopelessly out of date. So I mean, I could probably ramble on about this for a long time, but a sense of fairness, I think, is really important, and we need to make that practical in the things that we do. So the open access example is a really good practical example. I get surprised by colleagues who work internationally who don't support open access publication because they're, and there are various arguments against it, but I really don't get it, because it goes to that fundamental issue of fairness for me. I don't know if that's a helpful answer or not.
No, it is, Richard. It absolutely is. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for everyone who's watching, who'll be watching this later on when we make this public. Thank you for being here. I hope that the conversation that me and Richard had right now, and all the things that he said, will help you think in different ways. Some things you may agree with, some things you may disagree with, but as you can see as well, if you end up disagreeing with him, he's probably going to be the happiest person between the two of you, right? So enjoy that, challenge your minds, think beyond, and we'll see you next time on the next FAIR Dialogue. So till then, everyone, take care of yourself and have fun.